Sheriff Secrets of Shadow Hollow. The wind howled through Shadow Hollow like a banshee with a grudge, rattling the warped shutters of the old sheriff's station. Inside, Sheriff Amos Creed sat hunched over his desk, a flickering lantern casting jagged shadows across his weathered face. The station smelled of damp wood and stale coffee, a scent as familiar to Amos as his own heartbeat. He'd been sheriff of this nowhere town for 22 years, and in all that time, he'd never once thought of leaving. Shadow Hollow wasn't much: 2 dirt roads, a bar, a church, and a scattering of houses clinging to the edge of a pine-choked valley. But it was his. Tonight, though, something felt off. The air was heavy, like it was holding its breath. Amos rubbed the bridge of his nose, trying to shake the unease that had settled into his bones. He'd seen plenty in his years: bar fights, lost hikers, the occasional meth head passing through. But this was different. This was the kind of quiet that came before a scream. The phone rang, shrill and sudden, shattering the silence. Amos jolted, his hand hovering over the receiver before he picked it up. "Sheriff Station," he grunted. "Amos, it's Lila." The voice on the other end was tight, edged with panic. Lila Grayson ran the Hollow's only bar, a weathered dive called the Rusty Spur. "You need to get down here, now." "What's going on?" "It's Tommy. He's dead." Amos's stomach dropped. Tommy Grayson, Lila's younger brother, was a wiry kid with a quick smile and a knack for trouble. Last Amos had seen him, he'd been nursing a beer and flirting with some out-of-towner at the bar. "What happened?" "Just get here," Lila snapped, and the line went dead. Amos grabbed his hat and coat, the old leather creaking as he shrugged it on. He checked his revolver, 6 bullets, same as always, and headed out into the night. The wind bit at his face as he climbed into his truck, the engine coughing to life like it resented being woken. Shadow Hollow stretched out before him, a patchwork of dim light swallowed by the endless dark of the valley. The Rusty Spur was a 5-minute drive, but it felt like an eternity. When Amos pulled up, the parking lot was empty save for Lila's beat-up sedan and Tommy's rusted motorcycle tipped over on its side. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the gravel. Lila stood in the doorway, arms crossed tight, her blonde hair a wild tangle in the wind. "Inside," she said, jerking her head toward the bar. Amos followed her in. The place was a mess: overturned stools, shattered bottles, a jukebox stuck on a scratchy loop of some old country tune. And there, sprawled across the floor near the pool table, was Tommy. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. A dark pool spreading beneath him. A single gunshot wound bloomed red in the center of his chest. "Jesus," Amos muttered, kneeling beside the body. He pressed 2 fingers to Tommy's neck, though he knew it was pointless. The kid was cold. "Who did this?" he asked, looking up at Lila. "I don't know." Her voice cracked and she swiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I was in the back, closing up, heard a shot, ran out, and he was just like this. Whoever it was, they were gone." Amos scanned the room. No shell casings, no footprints in the spilled beer, nothing. It was too clean for a barroom brawl gone wrong. He stood, his knees popping, and fixed Lila with a hard stare. "You sure you didn't see anything? Anyone?" "I told you no," she snapped, then softened. "Amos, please. You've known Tommy since he was a kid. You've got to find who did this." "I will," he said, though the words felt hollow. He didn't have much to go on, and Shadow Hollow wasn't exactly crawling with deputies to help. It was just him, a one-man law in a town that barely cared. He spent the next hour securing the scene, calling the county coroner, an hour's drive away, and taking Lila's shaky statement. By the time he left, the first streaks of dawn were bleeding into the sky, turning the pines a bruised purple. He drove back to the station. Tommy's lifeless face burned into his mind. The next day, Shadow Hollow buzzed with whispers. Word of Tommy's death spread fast, as it always did in a town this small. Amos heard it all. Theories about a jealous boyfriend, a drug deal gone bad, even some nonsense about a ghost in the valley. He ignored the chatter and focused on what he could control. He started with Tommy's life, digging into the kid's habits, his friends, his enemies. Tommy had been a mechanic by trade, working odd jobs at the garage on Main Street. He was good with his hands, but he had a wild streak. Racing bikes, drinking too much, running his mouth when he shouldn't. Amos checked the garage first, talking to old man Hargrove, who'd employed Tommy off and on. Kid was trouble, but he was family, Hargrove said, spitting tobacco into a rusted can. Last I saw him, he was working on some fancy car, black sedan, out-of-state plates, said it was a rush job. When was this? Amos asked. 2 days ago. He finished it up, got paid cash, and took off. Seemed jumpy though, kept looking over his shoulder. Amos filed that away. A black sedan wasn't much, but it was something. He spent the afternoon chasing leads, talking to Tommy's drinking buddies, checking the bar's patchy security footage, which showed nothing but static, and driving the back roads looking for that car. By nightfall, he was bone-tired and no closer to an answer. That's when the call came. "Sheriff, it's Pete down at the church," the voice crackled through the radio. Pete was the town's unofficial handyman, a wiry old coot who kept the steeple from falling over. "You better get up here. Found something weird." Amos groaned but grabbed his keys. The church sat on a hill overlooking the valley, its white paint peeling like old skin. Pete met him at the door, clutching a flashlight. "Over here," Pete said, leading him around back to the graveyard. The wind rustled the pines and the air smelled of damp earth. Pete pointed the beam at a fresh mound of dirt, unmarked by a headstone. "Found it an hour ago. Ain't no burial schedule, and the ground's too soft. Someone's been digging." Amos's gut twisted. He grabbed a shovel from Pete's truck and started digging. The soil was loose, easy to move, and within minutes his blade hit something solid. He dropped to his knees, brushing away the dirt to reveal a black duffel bag. Inside were stacks of cash, hundreds, maybe thousands, wrapped in plastic, along with a small notebook. He flipped it open. The pages were filled with Tommy's messy scrawl. Dates, times, license plates. One entry stood out. Black sedan, California plates, March 7th, 25. Drop off at Spur, $10K, yesterday's date. Amos sat back on his heels, the pieces clicking into place. Tommy hadn't just been fixing cars. He'd been running something. Drugs, money, who knew? And that sedan was the key. The next morning, Amos tracked down the car. It was parked behind the old Miller barn, half hidden under a tarp. California plates, just like Tommy's note. He ran the number through the system. A rental out of Sacramento, reported stolen a week ago. No prints, no registration. Nothing to tie it to anyone. But the trunk held a surprise. A silenced pistol, .45 caliber, one round missing. It matched Tommy's wound. Amos didn't have a lab to confirm it, but he didn't need one. The gun, the car, the cash, it was all connected. He drove back to the station, piecing it together. Tommy had gotten in over his head, taken a job he couldn't handle, and paid for it. But who pulled the trigger? That night, he went back to the Rusty Spur. Lila was behind the bar, pouring shots for a handful of regulars. She looked up as he walked in, her eyes red-rimmed. "Any news?" she asked. "Maybe," Amos said, sliding onto a stool. "Tell me about the night Tommy died. Every detail." "I told you everything," she said, but her hands shook as she wiped the counter. "Try again." Lila sighed, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "There was a guy. Came in late, ordered a whiskey. Didn't talk much. Tommy knew him, though. They argued by the pool table. I couldn't hear what about. Then he left, and Tommy stayed to close up with me. I went to the back, and you know the rest." "What did he look like?" "Tall, dark hair, leather jacket. Had a scar over his eye." She hesitated. "Amos, Tommy argued with people all the time." Amos nodded, but his mind was racing. A stranger with a scar, a black sedan, a silenced gunshot. It wasn't a local. Someone had come to Shadow Hollow, done their business, and left Tommy bleeding out. The breakthrough came 2 days later. Amos was at the station, poring over Tommy's notebook, when the radio crackled. "Sheriff, it's Deputy Klein from county," a voice said. "Got a hit on that sedan. Rental was traced to a guy named Victor Reyes, small-time fixer out of Sacramento. Word is he's muscle for hire. Last seen heading east on 89. Amos grabbed his coat. Highway 89 cut through the mountains, a winding ribbon of asphalt that could take Reyes anywhere. But if he was still close, Amos had a chance. He called in a favor with the state troopers, gave them Reyes's description, tall, scarred, leather jacket, and hit the road. He found the sedan abandoned off a logging trail, 20 miles outside town. The driver's seat was empty, but a blood-stained rag on the floor told Amos someone had been hurt. He followed a faint trail into the woods, revolver in hand, the pines closing in around him. That's when he saw him. Victor Reyes leaned against a tree, clutching his side, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. He looked up as Amos approached, his scarred face twisting into a sneer. "Sheriff," he rasped, "you're late." "Who hired you?" Amos demanded, leveling the gun. Reyes laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. "Doesn't matter. Job's done. Kid got greedy, thought he could skim. Boss didn't like that. Tommy? Fast learner, slow thinker." Reyes coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Told him to stick to the plan. He didn't listen." Amos tightened his grip. "You killed him." "Had to. Loose ends." Reyes's eyes fluttered shut, and his head lolled back. Amos lowered the gun. Reyes was gone, taking his secrets with him. The boss was still out there, but for now, Shadow Hollow had its answer. Back in town, Amos told Lila everything. She cried, cursed Tommy's stupidity, and thanked him all at once. The cash went to the county, the gun into evidence, and Tommy into the ground. Life in Shadow Hollow crept on, quieter now, the whispers fading. But Amos couldn't shake it. Every night he sat at his desk, lantern flickering, wondering who'd sent Reyes, wondering what other secrets the valley held. Shadow Hollow was his, sure, but some shadows ran deeper than he'd ever known. And they weren't done with him yet.